can't believe you just said that. You are being completely ridiculous right now.
Ridiculous?
I'm telling you exactly how I feel and you're ignoring it.
She said you're too sensitive. And something in him went quiet. Not because she was right, but because he's heard it before. From his mother, from his coach, from every voice that ever told him that his feelings were inconvenient. So he did what he was trained to do. He swallowed it, moved on, told himself that it wasn't a big deal, and that's exactly how it starts. 48.8% of men have experienced psychological aggression from an intimate partner. That's the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Government data, not a men's right blog. 46% of all intimate partner violent victims are male. But here's the number that tells the real story. 97% of Australian men who've experienced domestic violence never report it. In the UK, only 10% of male victims go to police. For women, it's 27%. Men aren't experiencing less. They're just reporting less, naming less, acknowledging less. Because somewhere along the way, they learn that what happens to them doesn't count. 41% of boys say society expects them to be aggressive when angry. 35% were told directly, suck it up and be a man. This isn't an opinion. This is Plan International 2018. Dr. Leslie Brody's research on emotion development found that boys are systematically trained to suppress sadness and fear. Anger gets a pass. Everything else, it just gets buried. But buried isn't gone. Dr. Marsha Lyne's work on invalidation found that when someone's emotion is repeatedly dismissed, even in small ways, it becomes traumatic. A study by Krause, Mendel, and Lynch found that childhood emotion invalidation predicts chronic emotional inhibition in adulthood, which predicts depression, which predicts anxiety.
Who the is this?
No one. She's just an old friend from school.
Tell me the truth.
I am.
Don't speak to her again.
So by the time he's in a relationship, he's already spent years practicing ignoring his instincts, practicing doubting his perception, practicing the lie that his experience doesn't matter. He didn't learn this from her. He showed up pre-trained. Research by Bates and separately by Graves and Samp found that something the field didn't expect. Men experience more gaslighting in relationships than women. Not less. More. That didn't happen. You're imagining things. Oh, you're being crazy right now. Study from the University of Toronto found that long-term gaslighting produces what researchers call a broken sense of self. Feelings of worthlessness, guardedness that bleeds into every relationship after. But here's where it compounds. Men who hold traditional masculine belief show increased psychological distress during conflict and decreased willingness to seek help. They're not just being gaslit. They're being gaslit inside a system that tells them that admitting makes them less of a man. Research found that men self-invalidate more than women when they feel too little emotion. They don't just suppress, they judge themselves for having anything to suppress. So now you've got a man who was trained since childhood to distrust his feelings, is being told by his partner that his perception is wrong, believes that being affected by this makes him weak, won't ask for help because that would confirm his weakness. That's not a man who lacks strength. That's a man in a box with no doors. The prefrontal cortex handles decision-making, planning, emotional regulation. The part that says, this isn't right, I need to leave. Yale research calls it the most sensitive brain region to the detrimental effect of stress exposure. Here's what chronic stress does to it. Neurons shrink, synapses disappear, connection weaken, dendrite, the branches that let brain cells communicate, pull back and wither. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the fear center, grows. It gets louder. It takes over. The Yale researcher put it bluntly. Higher cognitive function of the recently evolved prefrontal cortex are weakened with exposure to stress, reducing top-down regulation and switching control of behavior to more primitive brain circuits. Did you hear that? Primitive brain circuits. His thinking brain goes offline. His survival brain, it takes the wheel. A 2009 study in Science by Diaz Ferreira showed that chronic stress physically reorganizes the brain. It stops running on goals and starts running on habits. The brain shifts from what should I do to what have I always done? A 2017 study in the Journal of Neuroscience confirmed it. Chronic stress produces overexploitation, sticking with what's familiar even when it's clearly failing. And here's the part that locks the cage. The research found that this effect is worse when someone feels like they have no control over the stressor. When the stress is unpredictable. When it comes from someone he loves. When he can't anticipate when the next criticism, the next dismissal, the next "you're too sensitive" is coming. That's when the damage accelerates. So when someone says, "Why didn't he just leave?" the answer is, his neurology was being rewritten against him. Not because he's broken, but because chronic stress breaks the part of the brain that makes clear decisions. And no one ever taught him what was happening. There's a clinical term for what happens next: reactive abuse. One person criticizes, dismisses, picks, pushes. The other person absorbs it. They keep absorbing it, and they keep absorbing it. Until one day, he snaps. He raises his voice, he slams something, and says words he cannot take back.
I expect better from you.
And suddenly, he's the problem. See? This is who you really are. I can't believe you'd speak to me that way. You need help. The months of provocation vanishes. Now there's only his reaction. Clinicians describe this as pushing someone to a breaking point, specifically so their response can be used against them. So they can be relabeled, reframed, recast as the aggressor. And research by Denise Hines at George Mason found that false accusations are significantly more likely to be used against male partners.
Are you serious right now?
I'm done with this conversation.
Fine. If that's how you feel, I'm leaving.
He's trained his whole life that anger is his only acceptable emotion. So when he finally shows it, it becomes the only thing anyone sees. His reaction becomes the story. Her behavior becomes invisible. And now he's not just confused, he's convinced he's the villain, which makes him more likely to stay, to make it up to her, to prove that he's not who she says he is. The trap closes. And he doesn't even know it's a trap because it doesn't feel foreign. It feels like every room he's ever been in. Most men who struggle with disrespect aren't struggling because they picked wrong ones. They're struggling because something in that dynamic feels like home. Chronic criticism echoes childhood dismissals. Walking on eggshells echoes the unpredictability they grew up navigating. Being told that their feeling doesn't matter confirms what they've quietly believed about themselves for decades. This isn't weakness. It's pattern recognition running in the background. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between familiar and safe. It just gravitates towards what it knows, what it survived before, what it learned to call love when it didn't know any better. So he finds himself drawn to people who treat him the way he was trained to expect. And he calls it chemistry. He calls it passion. He calls it "she just gets me." What he doesn't call it is repetition. And here's where it gets harder. Leaving isn't just leaving her.
How can you just walk away? Don't do this. Please stay.
It's leaving the story that he told himself about who he is. The story that says, you're the strong one. You can handle it. You don't need softness. You don't need care. You're fine. That story protected him once, when he was small and had no choice, when absorbing damage was the only strategy available. But it's not protecting him anymore. Now it's just keeping him in rooms that he should have walked out years ago. The men who break this don't become harder. They become honest. Honest enough to ask, why does this feel normal? Honest enough to admit, because someone taught me this was all I deserved. Honest enough to say out loud, maybe for the first time, I deserve better, and I deserve better now. They don't have thicker skin. They're not more alpha. They didn't unlock some secret. They just stopped negotiating with people who made them feel crazy for having standards. That's it. Somewhere along the way, they made a decision most men never make. My experience counts, even if no one else validates it, even if she says I'm wrong, even if I can't prove it in the court of law. What I felt, I felt. What I saw. And I'm done asking permission to believe myself. When something feels wrong, they don't look for witnesses. They don't build a case. They don't wait until it's bad enough to justify leaving. They trust themselves before the damage is done. When someone says you're overreacting, they don't argue. They just notice. Someone is trying to move the boundary, and they don't let it move. They stopped tracking incidents and started attracting pattern, because one comment is noise, but 10 comments is who she is. And when the pattern becomes undeniable, they don't try to love someone into respecting them, because they finally understand something that most men never learn. You can't convince someone to treat you well. The man who learns to hold this line doesn't become cold. He becomes clear. He stops confusing love with tolerance. He stops confusing commitment with endurance. Stops believing that his willingness to absorb damage proves his devotion. He starts treating his own experience as valid evidence. Starts trusting his intention in his chest when something is off. Starts respecting himself enough to walk away from people who won't. And here's what happens when he does. The relationship that couldn't survive his self-respect, they collapse. The ones that can, they become real. Because a woman who respects herself wants a man who respects himself. And for the first time, he's actually available for that. Not performing strength, not swallowing pain to keep the peace. Present. Clear. Whole. If you stayed too long, question yourself when you knew. Wondered if you were the problem when your gut said otherwise. You're not broken. You're not uniquely defective. You were trained to abandon yourself before anyone else had the chance. And then you met people who were happy to keep that going. The men who handle this well aren't smarter than you. They just stopped waiting for permission to believe their own experience. That permission was never someone else's to give. It was yours the whole time. You just didn't know you were allowed to use it. Now you do. Every day you stay in a dynamic that requires you to shrink is a day you teach yourself that shrinking is what you're for. And every day you choose differently, even in small ways, is a day you start building something new. Not harder, not colder. Just a man who finally stopped asking the people who hurt him to tell him it counted. It's been your girl, Rene here. I'll see you guys in my next video.